Babes, if you are in the mood for some lukewarm tea right now, then let me tell you that this is the place where you need to be. So it's time to kick off my end of year content where I'm going to be talking about anything and everything to do with my reading over the course of 2025. We are of course going to be starting at the low point, which is my 10 worst books that I read across the year. However, this year is an interesting one for me. My stats video is the last video that you are going to see in this little series, but just to give you a little sneak peek pertaining to this video, in the year of 2024, I had 22 2-star reads. I was a negative Nancy. In 2025, I had 8. So I have scraped together a list of the 10 most disappointing books that I read across the year, but the tea is not going to be that hot. There's only one book that I truly disliked, and the rest of them just either weren't for me or were a little bit more on the mediocre end. I will say that I have DNF'd an enormous amount of books in 2025, and sadly I will not be able to give you that exact number because typically I have never tracked the books that I DNF, and that is because traditionally there aren't really that many, but I think across the course of the last year I have DNF'd at least 2 books per month. So going forward into 2026, I'm not really expecting that to change. I have decided that my time is precious and it is better spent reading books I'm genuinely excited about and want to continue on with. So I am going to be keeping note of all of my DNFs for the next year so that we can talk about that when we get to 2027, which seems so far away, but my do the years fly these days. So if you're enjoying this kind of content, then please do not forget to subscribe because my best books of the year will be coming very shortly, and that is actually going to be a much more enthusiastic video than this one. But we're going to be going in no particular order aside from saving that one that I am a little bit more salty about until the end. That is also the more recent book that I've read, so I feel like I have a little bit more to say about it. But as I mentioned, a lot of these are just more on the mediocre side. They weren't great, but I'm also not particularly pressed about them either, so my thoughts may be brief. But kicking us off, we have a pretty recent read for me actually, which was The Very Secret Society of Irregular Witches. Now obviously I have included 10 books in this video, but I only gave 8 books 2 stars. A lot of these books are 3-star reads, which for me typically means that I did enjoy them, but I wasn't overly enthusiastic about them. I didn't hate them, I didn't love them. They were kind of middle of the road, and The Very Secret Society of Irregular Witches definitely falls into that category for me. So this one was kind of marketed as a cozy fantasy story about a woman who goes to take care of a group of witch children. I think the main character in this book is called Mika, and she grew up in a house with a older witch who never really had much to do with her life. In this world, which is our world actually, but if you are a witch, you tend to be an orphan. So she is adopted by an older witch, but to keep witches safe, they tend to live in seclusion, which is something that her caretaker very firmly believes in. And so she doesn't really have much to do with Mika, and Mika spends her entire life with complicated feelings about this woman and also feeling like she really missed out on ever having a sense of family. So when somebody reaches out to her because they suspect that she is a witch and asks her to help them come and take care of these 3 witch children, she jumps at the chance. So I'm generally not a super cozy reader, but sometimes I do like those slightly more heartwarming vibes, and I will pick up something more along these lines. And I was optimistic about this book for that reason, but I was also aware that it could be a little bit of a miss for me. However, the reason why this book didn't particularly gel with me is not because it's cozy, it's because it's actually a romance disguised as a cozy fantasy. This book spent way more time talking about our main character developing feelings for one of the people who looks after these children. These kids are from like a similar background where they've been adopted by an older witch who doesn't really have anything to do with their lives, but they live on this big estate, so they have like a gardener, a housekeeper, and somebody there to educate them. And one of these men our main character finds appealing, and I felt like the book spent a lot more time focusing on developing that relationship than it did on the magical lives of these children and how having this woman present in their life who knows what they're going through and can help them. And I think that is why I didn't really gel with this book. I also don't think that either of these 2 themes were executed particularly well. I felt like this book lacked depth and emotion, so I wasn't particularly attached to any of it, and I left it just feeling really underwhelmed. The next one I feel like is a real victim of how popular Romantasy is these days, and that is Lore of the Wilds by Annalise Sabrana. So in, I think, April This year, I did a series on my channel called the Romantasy Rundown, where I read the first year of books that were included in FairyLoot's Romantasy subscription. I did this because I've previously been such a big fan of Romantasy, but I feel like I've read so many misses over the last like 3 or 4 years that I wanted to know whether I still cared about this genre, and I used the Romantasy subscription because FairyLoot are obviously trying to appeal to a wide range of readers within that genre, so this subscription was going to provide me with a variety of different kinds of Romantasy books. And I think the very first book that they included was The Law of the Wilds, and my recollection of this one is a little bit hazy, so please do bear with me, but we're following a young woman who lives in a human village and the humans are oppressed by the Fae. However, the Fae have this library that they cannot enter because it's warded against them, and so they take this girl out of her village and they ask her to explore this library because they're looking for this particularly powerful book and they obviously can't get access to it. So she does start to explore that for them, and it's a little bit of a cozy story in that regard. The first, I want to say, third of the book follows that plot line, but something goes horribly wrong and it sets the plot in a different trajectory. This is also a book that has a kind of love triangle in it, as illustrated by, I think, the cover of all editions, but specifically the FairyLoot one. And honestly, I can't give you any more details on the plot than that. They have faded from my memory because I do think that this book did try to do too much, and I feel like we were missold the premise of this girl exploring this library when really the actual core plot of this series was something else, and we pivoted to that something else very, very quickly. And overall, in terms of the plot, the story, the writing, the characters, it wasn't doing too much for me, but I did think that it was okay for the most part. However, this book did feel very solidly like a young adult fantasy for, I want to say, about 80% of it. Even the elements of romance we were getting in there, it felt very much like young adult fantasy that I have read and enjoyed in the past when I was younger and reading that predominantly, and also I do still enjoy YA more recently as well in some instances. But then we had the smut, the so unnecessary smut that honestly made me feel quite uncomfortable, because even though we are being told on page that the characters are of a certain age, even though we're going into this knowing that it's a romantasy and assuming that it's going to be heavily romantic, and all of the FairyLoot books in the Romantasy sub do contain at least a little bit of smut, and I did rate the smut levels of the books throughout that project, I did as well. It felt really uncomfortable because in my experience of reading the book, it felt so solidly like young adult fantasy. So this to me felt like a book that could have done very well in the young adult fantasy genre, but because it was trying to capitalize on the trend of Romantasy, the smut that was inserted just felt really weird in comparison to the rest of the content in this book. It felt very confused, and story-wise, like I said, it was okay. It wasn't amazing, but that was really the cherry on the cake for this one for me, and not in a good way. I have read and really enjoyed the Book of the Ancestor series by Mark Lawrence, but this year I did also read Prince of Thorns. This is Mark Lawrence's, I'm pretty sure, first published series, and I was aware going into it that it may not be for me because of how brutal it was. And I have read Grimdark in the past, but I knew that we were going to be following this morally grey character who does terrible things, and his things that he does are not excusable. It's not a case of like, oh, he's an assassin but he feels bad about it. Like, he does heinous things and he enjoys what he's doing. But this is following a young man who is a prince, and when he's a child he sees his mother and his brother murdered, and he's like, I want to say around 10 years old at this point. So he goes home to his father because the people who kill his mother and his brother don't know that he's there, and he expects his father to very heavily punish the other kingdom that is responsible for the deaths of his family. Like, he thinks that they're going to be going to war, but his father is appeased by a trade deal. So the main character feels betrayed by this, and he goes into the prison of the castle and he releases this bunch of mercenaries, all like older grisly men, and he asks them to help him go to this other kingdom that killed his family and help him get his revenge. And remember, I said he's a child at this point. We're then following him a small amount of years later. I want to say he's about 13, and we are following this like 13-year-old boy literally raping and pillaging his way through villages and decimating them on his quest for revenge, and he is not remorseful for any of his actions, and you're not supposed to sympathize with him. That is not the kind of story that this is, but I do need a character that I can root for in some regard, and I do also very much like morally grey characters who do bad things for good reasons, but I did not feel like his reasoning was good enough for the depths of depravity that he sinks to. And then you you do also, of course, have this extra element of suspending your disbelief because he's 13 years old. And I've had this discussion with other books and not being able to believe that characters of a certain age are capable of actions. And the reason why I don't believe that is not because I don't believe that children can have really hard lives that potentially turn them into terrible people or people who do terrible things. It's because I can't believe that a 13-year-old can command the respect of 20, 30, 40-year-old criminals who have done and seen some shit. And that was the reason why I could not take this man seriously. So I do enjoy Mark Lawrence in other elements of his work, but I do not think that this series or the spin-off series is going to be for me. It also, in terms of the writing, I expected it to be a little bit more in-depth than it was. It was quite a surface level quick read, actually, if I'm being honest. And it did have an interesting element of the plot where we realized that while this world seems like a medieval kind of style fantasy, it's actually a far futuristic world that's set like post-apocalypse, and that did intrigue me, but not enough to really continue on with this story. Back on the mediocre front, I read Love in Focus by Lila Lee. This one was a sapphic romance following a girl who works for, I believe, a magazine, and she breaks up with her fiance. She moves in with her friends, and she has this big project coming up at work where she finds out that she's going to be working with this influential photographer. She then finds out that this influential photographer is actually her ex-girlfriend from when she was in college, and this girl just disappeared one day. They were in love, they thought they were going to be together forever, and she wakes up one day and this girl is gone. So she was obviously very hurt by this, but on the flip side of that, the photographer left because her mother was sick and she had to go and take care of her, and she did eventually come back around a month after she'd left and found out that her ex-girlfriend had moved on and was now engaged to this man. So she then just kind of moved on with her life, thinking that this girl never cared about her at all. Fast forward a number of years and they're now thrown back together to work on a project that is very important for both of their careers, so they need to sort out their problems. That is fine and an interesting premise for a relationship. I have discovered I do quite like a second chance romance, particularly when we have an element of seeing how the relationship developed in the first place, so that I can kind of grow that attachment along with the characters. And then we also had the structure of the project that they were working on, which adds just like a little interesting, you know, like real life element to flesh out the characters. In theory, because this book just fell really flat for me. Like I said, this is one of the more mediocre ones on this list. It's not that I hated it, I just don't really feel like it achieved very much. I felt like the tension, the sexual tension, the romantic tension in the relationship just wasn't really there. There was no real point throughout this book that I was rooting for these characters and actually wanted them to be together. Like, I didn't really care either way what they did. The way that they hashed out their drama was truly not a hashing out. They actually had a lot of very healthy discussions, explaining to each other kind of what happened in the moment and how they were hurt by it, and then trying to like move on and rebuild a friendship going forward. And as you know, if you're familiar with the romance genre, we tend to always have a third act breakup. Even that was incredibly healthy, incredibly non-dramatic, and had absolutely no tension to it, which meant that the eventual reconnection of the characters for their happily ever after or happy for now was also very anticlimactic and did nothing for me. I just feel like this was very, very surface level. None of the facets that I need in a contemporary romance were executed especially well, and overall I do think it was pretty bland. In 2025, I also DNF'd the Lady of Darkness series by Melissa K. Roerich, and I have put Lady of Ashes in as my worst book for this video, but honestly past the first book of this series, which I gave the benefit of the doubt to, this was not very good. What happened, guys? Y'all told me that this was a top tier gold standard romantasy series, and I feel so misled because this was essentially all of Sarah J Maas's books chopped into pieces, shook in a bag and like pulled out at random and stitched back together. I don't really think there was anything original in this series that wasn't borrowed from a Sarah J Maas book, if I'm being brutally honest. And you know what? I'm normally not this dramatic when it comes to discussing books. Like, I'm a very middle of the road kind of person. I discuss the pros and the cons, why other people might like it even though I didn't. But this is my worst books of the year list, okay? I'm gonna be getting a little salty, and talking about this book now, I'm realizing how salty I actually was. So this one is following a woman who is an assassin. However, she's not currently working. She's currently living in a lord's house because she has had a falling out with the Assassin Lord. And he is desperately trying to get her to come back into the fold because she's one of these like 3 renowned assassins that works for him. And so he offers her a job that she can't refuse because upon completion, he will give her access to the Fey Fire Prince who is responsible for the death of her mother. Sounds interesting to me. Sounds reminiscent of Throne of Glass, but you know, reminiscent is fine. This was not reminiscent though. This was pretty much Throne of Glass. The second book was essentially A Court of Mist and Fury. The third book added elements of Crescent City. And by the time we got to book 4, which I can't remember if I DNF'd in book 4 or book 5, I think I DNF'd book 4. But at that point, we essentially just had a lot of talking, a lot of posturing, a lot of dick measuring, a lot of forcing people into submission, lots of conflict that didn't really make any sense and felt like drama for the sake of drama, interspersed with quite lengthy sex scenes that you couldn't skip. And you know what? I typically don't. I know some people do, and that's fine. I do tend to read them, and occasionally if I'm getting a little bored, I will maybe just skim the smut to get back to the story. But the main character and the love interest kept having their most important discussions and working out their battle strategy in the bedroom. So then I had to read the tedious, repetitive smut that was coming every like 100 pages in this book because it had the only important information that pertained to the plot in it. So sadly, this series is not for me. I know a lot of people really love this one. I just really felt like it was too long-winded, and as somebody who has read all of Sarah J Maas's books, I've been a Sarah J Maas reader for the last like 10 years. I've reread a bunch of them, like you can see them all here. I am too familiar with her work to not see how overwhelmingly similar the Lady of Darkness series is to all 3 of Sarah J Maas's series that I've read before. I don't know whether this one is one that I feel lukewarm about or not. The book in question, I don't have super strong feelings on, but I am very disappointed by this author. And the book in question is Cursebound by Sarah L. Arifi. So this is the sequel to Feybound. And Feybound was okay. I liked it a lot. I didn't love it, but I have loved Sarah L. Arifi in the past. The first series that Sarah L. Arifi wrote, which is the Ending Fire series, I loved book 1 and 2. I was disappointed by book 3, and I would say that it was probably on my worst books list of last year. But Feybound felt more of a debut than the Ending Fire series did, even though it did come afterwards. I think it was published between books 2 and 3 of the Ending Fire, but I did like it. And then I read Cursebound, and I felt like it nosedived so dramatically, kind of like the final book in the Ending Fire trilogy did, if I'm being honest. It is so bizarre because I almost feel at this point that the first 2 books that Sarah L. Arifi wrote are not written by the same person who wrote the following 3. And I don't really know what's happening there. I don't know whether the first 2 books they published, they wrote before they had a publisher, and so now being on a demanding publishing schedule is kind of making them rushed, or the author has to write faster and then the books aren't as good. I don't know. I don't know what the issue is. When I read Feybound and it felt a little bit more like a debut than the Final Strife did, I did think that maybe Feybound had been written first, but the Final Strife had been published first, so now they were cycling back around and publishing things that Sarah L. Arifi just kind of had in their backlog. Now I'm really not so sure. But to tell you a little bit about what this series is about, it's quite an interesting premise because it's set in a world where there used to be human, fae, and elves. However, only elves remain. And our 2 main characters are sisters. They are both elven, and one of them is a general and one of them is a seer. And the seer tells her sister that she is going to seek glory in the east. So when the general, I think she's called Euron, goes out on a mission and she finds nothing, like the thing that they're supposed to be doing isn't there, the people they're supposed to be fighting aren't there. So she thinks about what her sister said and she goes to seek glory in the east, and this results in her battalion being ambushed and killed. So she is exiled for this, and her sister follows her into exile along with Euron's second in command, and they stumble across the land of the Fae and discover that the life that they've known has been a lie, and that their people are maybe not great people after all and have actually been stripping other communities of valuable resources. One thing that I will say about Cursebound is that the way that the plot advanced, in theory, like the plot points were interesting, the execution of them, not so much. These are quite small books as well. They're between 300 and 400 pages, so for fantasy, not incredibly long. And I felt like book 2 was so rushed. The thing that I loved about the Ending Fire trilogy by Sarah L. Arifi, at least in the first 2 books, is that their character development, phenomenal. Like the way that the trauma that the characters suffer stays with them and lingers and affects their character going forward. Amazing. I felt like Sarah Elarifi never missed a beat in that regard. But in this, it was kind of like nothing that ever happened to any of the characters affected them. We had traumatic event after traumatic event back to back in Cursebound, and we didn't take any time to kind of process that. The characters just carried on as normal, moving into their next life-altering experience. Pretty much exactly the same person they were as they started. So I've decided I'm going to be DNF in this series. Sarah Elarifi does have a 2026, which is Cleopatra. It's a historical fantasy. I do like historical fantasy depending on the time period. So I'm very enthusiastic about that one. But if it turns out to be anything like Cursebound or the final book in the Ending Fire trilogy, then I think that I'm sadly going to be saying goodbye to Sarah Elarifi going forwards. A completely random book that I picked up in 2025 that was sent to me by the publisher as part of a welcome pack when I became an ambassador for them was Hotter in the Hamptons by Ting. So I went into this pretty much completely blind. At the time, I did not know that this was written by an influencer. I didn't know that it was ghostwritten. I was literally just going off the fact that I literally had it in my hands and the synopsis. So this one is following an influencer who says something on a live stream that gets her cancelled. At the same time as this, she suffers a relationship breakdown and she goes to the Hamptons to essentially lick her wounds. And when she's there, she realizes that the person that lives next door to this house that she's staying in is the reporter that wrote an expose on her that got her cancelled in the first place. She did an interview with this woman to try and like clear her name and explain herself, but actually this reporter just wrote this scathing expose that essentially has ended her career, potentially forever, potentially temporarily. However, as those two keep crossing paths throughout the summer, they do start to fall for each other. So I will say that this was relatively entertaining while I was reading it. It did keep me captivated and kept me turning pages. However, by the time I got to the end of this, I was just like, what is the point? I did think that this was going to be a sapphic romance, but it's actually more of a self-discovery story as our main character learns a little bit more about herself, exploring her sexuality and kind of finding her confidence again and getting back on her feet. One of the main issues I had is that she is so unlikable. She is exactly all of the things that people are saying that she is when they're critiquing her, when this reporter writes this expose on how her content has no substance and how she's just like chasing fame and she's lost any level of authenticity. She has an argument with her fiance who breaks up with her at the beginning of the book at some point. She essentially criticizes him for everything that she has been doing. The whole thing is so hypocritical. I would say that aside from the fact that she does explore her sexuality a little bit and she develops kind of a new approach and attitude towards content, as a person, she does not grow at all throughout this book, and she is so horrible to her best friend who has invited her to the Hamptons as a refuge from everything else that is going on in her life, and she is literally just like so self-absorbed and awful throughout this entire thing. And then after I finished this book and I looked into it a little bit more and I found out that it was ghost written essentially, and that the reason why it was ghost written is because the author herself, Tinks, admitted that she did not have the experience to write this book, so she hired a queer ghostwriter to write that for her, which is interesting because that is the backbone of the entire story. And I'm not saying that you 100% have to have lived experience to be able to write about people who are different than you, like not at all. As long as you do your research, that is absolutely fine. I just find it really interesting that the author wanted to write a story about a queer woman, but not being a queer woman herself, realized that somebody else had to write that story. She admits essentially, I'm not qualified to write this story. I need somebody else to do it for me. Maybe just write something else. Like if you can't write the story that you want to write, just write something else, you know? Write something else. I don't know. It's just bizarre to me. But that one was fine. A little bit of a waste of my time, entertaining in the moment, but I don't really, I think that the book lacked purpose, I guess. I didn't know what the point was when I finished. I'm not going to linger on this one too long, but I did finish the Wheel of Time series in 2025, and I'll be honest, I don't think it's worth it. So many people say it's worth it. Like it can be miserable, it can be tedious, it can be slow, it can be a slog, it's overly wordy, but it's worth it. They say, they tell you. I don't think it's worth it. So we're putting A Memory of Light by Robert Jordan and Brandon Sanderson on this list. Brandon Sanderson stepped in after Robert Jordan died, and he wrote, I think, the last 3 books in the series. This series peaked at book 12, I think it is. The first one that was written by Brandon Sanderson Sanderson was amazing, but I just feel like all of the action is already over before we get to the final book in this series, and that's just kind of like wrapping up loose ends, and it just felt like a massive waste of my time. Honestly, this series felt like a massive waste of my time. If you guys don't know what Wheel of Time is, it is essentially a epic story of good versus evil, where we are following a character called the Dragon Reborn who is reincarnated into every age to play this pivotal role in this eternal struggle between the forces of good and evil. It's of course like one of the building blocks of the genre. Since I've read Wheel of Time, I can see its influence on so many other things that I've read. The Ruin of Kings by Jen Lyons is very different tonally, but it also essentially is like a more diverse, more fast-paced, more chaotic Wheel of Time. The Lycanius trilogy by James Islington, which I've just finished, essentially takes this one small part of Wheel of Time and just expands upon it and runs with it. And I wanted to read this series and see it to its conclusion because of that, but I just don't think that Robert Jordan is a writer. I think that he is a storyteller. I think that the bones of his story are solid, and the story that he was trying to tell, I think, is worth reading. In execution, I do not think that he was the best person to tell that story. It is very long-winded. It's very repetitive. It has slice of life elements. I found the characters in a lot of ways, and obviously I know I'm reading this from the lens of being somebody in 2025, and the series was publishing, like, it started in I think 1990, so society has come on a long way, and it's a little bit sexist. It is. And I found a lot of the characters insufferable. Like Matt Cawthon, man, I can't stand him. He's honestly the worst. So yeah, I didn't have a good time with Wheel of Time at all, but you guys knew that when I was struggling through it. I am glad that I've read it in terms of now I've gained the knowledge to be able to see its influence on the fantasy genre as a whole, but it wasn't a good time for me, and I do think that the final book was very anticlimactic. One that I actually can't tell you too much about, but you know, I needed to fill a gap, because who wants a top 9 or a bottom 9, should we say? This had to be a top 10. And so A Curse of Blood and Wolves by Melissa McTurnan, the first 2 books for the Fairy Loot Romantasy box were not it. These were the first 2 that I read for that project, this one and of course Lore of the Wilds. This was a paranormal werewolf story. So first off, I don't love paranormal romance, and I especially don't really like werewolves, but it was also just like really flat. I couldn't even tell you the plot of this one at this point. I know that it was a Little Red Riding Hood retelling. I know that it involved the main character being stalked through the woods by like the love interest, but like she liked it. It was a kink of hers, so it was fine. It gave me nothing. So it's an honorable mention because I can't tell you anything about it aside from I probably wouldn't recommend that you read it. Even if you like paranormal romance of werewolves, wouldn't recommend that you read it. And then the last book, now that I've talked about all of those, I don't know if this is the one that I'm the saltiest about. It is the only one that I own physically because I read it so recently though, and that is This Wicked Fate by Kaylin Bayron. So this one is the sequel to This Poison Heart, and This Poison Heart was one of my biggest surprises of 2025. It's a young adult fantasy following a girl who lives in Brooklyn with her mother. She is adopted, and somebody comes to tell her that she has inherited an estate from an estranged aunt, and she does not know who this woman is, but she goes to find out along with her mothers, and they find out that she has actually inherited this massive house with a poison garden in it, and the main character has an ability to manipulate plant life. She's in tune with plants, they respond to her emotions, she can make them grow, she's immune to poisons, and she realizes that this poison garden and the apothecary that's contained within the manor forms an important role in this community, and people are coveting the poison garden for that. So the first book read very much like a contemporary fantasy. It had a little bit of Greek mythology in there tied to the origins of like maybe there's plant magic and our main character's family. This went from 0 to 100 on the fantasy scale. We started this book, there were Greek gods flying around everywhere. We went on this epic magical quest. The main character was a backseat role in this entire book. This was taken over by side characters, some of which we had only been introduced to in like the last 2 chapters of book 1. It's a direct continuation, which is fine, but the pace just like accelerated so fast that this thing was entirely one note. Like it was action, 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 action from start to finish. And these aren't very long books. So the tone shift between book 1 and book 2 was drastic, and I just did not see anything at all that I enjoyed about book 1 in book 2. I did have criticisms of book 1. One of them was that I felt like some of the side characters, especially like our main character's mothers, were a little bit of a caricature. Like they didn't feel like fleshed out people, and the dialogue was a little cheesy. So that was still present in book 2, but everything that I loved was gone. So I'm doubly upset about this because I don't think it was great, but also after loving book 1 and not really expecting to, having this be book 2 has made me saltier about it than I would have been if I didn't have such strong positive feelings for the first book in this series. So for this one, I would recommend either just reading, I mean, book 1 ends on a cliffhanger is the thing, but if you really wanted to read book 1, just don't read book 2. And if you're not somebody who can just stop in the middle of a series, then just don't start this one. I don't think it's worth it, guys. So those are my worst books of 2025. For somebody who professed at the beginning of this video to give you just lukewarm tea, I actually think, you know what, we stuck that tea in the microwave, we put it on for a couple of minutes and it came out scalding hot. I actually wasn't expecting that, but you know what, you came to a worst books of the year video for a reason. Can you be mad at me for being salty? Isn't that what you wanted when you clicked on this video? I mean, somebody will be mad at me. Somebody will click on the worst books of the year video and be mad that I didn't like the books. But that's just the internet, man. What can you do? So down in my comments, let me know what your worst book of the year is. Do that. What is the one book that you wish you hadn't read in 2025? And if you would like to let me know you were here, but you don't feel like you have anything to say, leave me I'm really not sure, a wheel. Leave me a wheel emoji for Wheel of Time. Do remember as well that the rest of my year-end content is coming very, very shortly, and the next video that you guys are going to see on this channel is going to be my best books of 2025, where we do the direct opposite of what we've done here. But aside from that, guys, please don't forget to like this video if you liked it and subscribe if you wanna. If you head down to my description box, you'll find a link to my Goodreads, my Instagram, and my Patreon if you want to follow me on any of those. So that's it from me today, guys. Bye!
Oh, you bite your friend like chocolate. You say you're go when nobody knows, with guns hidden under our petticoats. We're never gonna quit it, no, we're never gonna quit it, no.